if the sea market, this idea that this has all these exotic animals, is being scapegoated by the Chinese government to cover up for a potential viral leak. They have been known to leak viruses before. This would not be a first time. There is a precedence to this. When you just back up just a little bit, well, just south of the river, you got the virology center right dab in the middle of the city. And here we have the sea markets. We're talking about 16 miles. What are the statistical chances that this naturally occurring pathogen would have happened 16 miles away from the exact disease center that is set up to study the same class of viruses? Guys, something's going on.
A new entrant onto the scene of reporting out the lab leak hypothesis was introduced. Stunning new facts, and it puts the mainstream media to shame. It gives even more credence to the theory. Nicholas Wade, he's a former science correspondent for the New York Times, out with a bombshell new multi-thousand word study for the Bureau of Atomic Scientists, in which he does what I consider to be the best job so far of investigating the origins of the outbreak. If you don't know the broad contours of the lab leak theory, let me lay it out for you.
Welcome to Second Earth Alternative. So today we're going to deviate a little bit away from the whole topic of UFOs, which is really interesting, but we have covered other topics, one in particular being the coronavirus. And it appears that new information has come to light that, once again, it's not a pattern that I particularly enjoy, but it seems that we have a ton of videos that have been throttled, or I guess you can say censored, which the story eventually ends up coming true as time rears its pretty face. And when COVID-19 first took place in Wuhan, China, when the numbers were very low, I made the claim that this virus seems like it's airborne, and not is it just airborne, that it's basically going to be in contact with over 1 billion people in a span of 3 to 4 weeks. Tens of millions, hundreds of millions, will reach 1.3 billion people in less than a month. And I said this weeks before any flight restriction, and I actually had a theoretical physicist who told me I should be going into an insane asylum. So although I don't enjoy the idea of being censored, I am glad that information finally surfaced that once again shows that some of the information that we were providing at the time was correct. And in this particular case, we're talking about a bio leak. We also talked about how there was a biosecurity 4 lab only a few miles away from the epicenter of the contagion of the whole epidemic, and that it seems very likely that the virus came from that lab. And we were scoffed at. I mean, the mainstream media was basically making fun of people who believe these type of ideas and basically calling us conspiracy theorists that are not listening to the scientific consensus. So I wanted to start here with this NPR article where it says, theory that COVID came from a Chinese lab takes on new life in wake of WHO report. Before COVID-19, few scientists would have pegged the city of Wuhan and temperate central China as a likely starting point for a global coronavirus pandemic. Its climate and fauna don't fit the bill, and neither does its wildlife. This is something we're going to go over in just a second. But the city of 11 million straddling the Yangtze River is home to some of China's most advanced biological research laboratories. And one of the secretive state-run institutions, the Wuhan Institute of Virology, is known to conduct experiments on the kind of virus that has killed nearly 3 million people worldwide so far since 2019. I think there were a lot of people who did put together the fact that you had an outbreak in Wuhan and you had these laboratories in Wuhan fairly immediately, said David Faith, who was an Asia advisor in the Trump administration's State Department when the coronavirus emerged. The question was, what does this evidence tell us, said Faith. At the time, not much. Now, though the lab leak hypothesis seems to have found new life, on Tuesday, the World Health Organization released a joint report with Beijing on the origins of the pandemic following a 4-week investigation in China. It concluded, among other things, that the lab leak hypothesis was extremely unlikely. So China, who makes fun of the US, militaristically has threatened us recently, who steals our data, who steals our intellectual property, who is putting spies in the numbers of thousands, not just in job sites, but also in academia. Oh yeah, we should trust what the Chinese people are saying. And we should trust the WHO, who have individuals who won't even recognize the country of Taiwan.
WHO considered Taiwan's membership. Hello?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you. I couldn't hear your question.
Let me repeat the question.
No, that's okay. Let's move to another one then.
I'm actually curious on talking about Taiwan as well, on Taiwan's case.
But WHO Director General Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus said he does not believe the team's assessment of the lab leak possibly was extensive enough. Why would he not believe in the assessment of the lab leak? Oh, let me think. Maybe because the director of the WHO is, though he's not from China, he is from Ethiopia and is part of a political party that sympathizes with the Communist Party. His party is very close to the concept of communism and in a sense is allies with China's interests. So yeah, I should trust this guy in what he has to say. The CDC, who said that we should not be wearing masks in the beginning, but this channel said, yes, we should wear masks. And then they reversed their decision while thousands of elderly people are dying. I should trust them, even though my assessment was more right than their assessment in the beginning. Reading further. Although the team has concluded that a laboratory leak is the least likely hypothesis, this requires further investigation, potentially with additional missions involving specialist experts, which I am ready to deploy, he told WHO members according to a written statement. I'm very curious if he hand-selected those specialists. Jeremy Meltz, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, has been an outspoken proponent of such an investigation. I'm not saying that I'm certain that COVID-19 stems from an accidental lab leak, but it would be absolutely irresponsible and could only be politically motivated to say that it's not even worth having a full investigation, he said. Yeah, that's an understatement. A State Department fact sheet from mid-January highlights reports of sick lab researchers at the Wuhan Institute of Virology in the fall of 2019, notes the dangerous type of coronavirus research the lab was conducting and said there were also secret military activity at the lab. A type of military that will lock their citizens, basically weld their doors shut. That's the type of actions they're willing to take with their own citizens. And they surround that lab while researchers are getting sick. But nothing to see here, ladies and gentlemen. China has refuted the claims, yeah, you think. Critics of the WHO report, such as Meltz, said that the expert team that visited the lab took their Chinese interlocutors at their word and didn't dig. Meltz said that's insufficient. If in the middle of the worst pandemic in a century, China wants to tell the rest of the world, screw you, it's not even worth investigating, that's on them. But we shouldn't give them a free pass, he said. Yeah, but also, something else we should mention about China. I don't know how many people are aware of this, but when the virus first started taking place, the Chinese government specifically shut down their own domestic flights, all the while they were faking data on coronavirus and encouraging international flights. It's one thing if this virus was leaked because of ineptitude in this particular lab. It's a whole nother when entire governments, in order to save face, in order to not be the ones who are essentially hurting economically, when they take a proactive approach to actually contaminate the entire world, Ladies and gentlemen, that's almost like an act of war. I mean, I don't know how else to say it. This is just unbelievable that the media just kind of blindly lets this type of information go as if like it's not important. Like, who is reporting on that? Who is reporting that the Chinese were closing domestic flights but encouraging international flights? I haven't seen a lot of people reporting on that. It seems like a pretty important fact when you consider all the lies and all the subterfuge that we're seeing happening with this pandemic. It seems like an important piece of information to know. Look, does it take a YouTube channel, a little guy who hardly even talks about this, to actually bring basic facts to the table? Is that the type of world that we're living in? This is so discouraging, ladies and gentlemen. While Meltz and others, like Faith, believe there's more circumstantial evidence that SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, came from a lab than naturally, many scientists say the opposite. Based on the available evidence, they believe, like the WHO team, that the coronavirus appears far more likely to have emerged naturally. Why? What is their evidence that it's emerging naturally? Because I've looked at a lot of evidence that seems to be the very opposite of what they're claiming. I think there was a memo at the beginning of the coronavirus from a scientist that was signed on by many scientists that basically said that when you look at this in a microscope, it seems pretty obvious that this was an artificial virus, that a lot of virologists looked at it and instantly knew by its construction that this was not a naturally occurring virus. And talking about science, isn't it funny that the horseshoe bat is the one culprit, the one host that actually could have carried the virus, but the horseshoe bat is not indigenous in Wuhan. But, as it says here in this article, the Batcave solves mystery of deadly SARS virus and suggests new outbreak could occur. This article that was written in 2017, well before the pandemic, well, it says here, to clinch the case, a team led by Shizheng Li and Kiwi Ji of the Wuhan Institute of Virology in China sampled thousands of horseshoe bats in locations across the country. The most challenging work is to locate the caves, which usually are in remote areas. I repeat, the most challenging work is to locate the caves which usually are in remote areas, said Kiwi, after finding a particular cave in Yunnan, southwestern China, in which the strains of coronavirus looked similar to human versions. The researchers spent 5 years monitoring the bats that lived there, collecting fresh guano and taking anal swabs. These bats, they are the culprit, they are the hosts for coronavirus. They are not endemic to the Wuhan general area. These bats come, I believe, almost 1,000 miles away. In that specific virology center, which happens to be within 20 miles of where the epicenter was actually studying that exact species of bats to which the virus was said to have emerged from. How is that not scientific? How is that not being validated? Look, to me, it's obvious propaganda. It's obvious that there is Chinese interest. It's obvious that China was faking a lot of their data, that they wanted the world to be exposed, and that there are players in the WHO who are in support of China's interests. To me, that can all be easily validated. And honestly, I'm kind of sick of this article because NPR is really very biased, I would say. You know, they used to be, because they were like funded by the public, they used to be the actual news, the ones who brought you the real news. But I noticed that in the last 5-10 years that they've really kind of skewed towards this propaganda CNN type of news. I don't know if you noticed this. As much as I want to trust NPR, or I used to trust NPR, I've seen a lot of stories as of late that really gives me doubt as to what their actual interests are, which is, in my opinion, not to tell the news exactly as it is. A lot of stories might be like that, but in short, it's tough to trust NPR, man. Just like it's tough to trust CNN when their director actually claims that the entire mainstream network is propaganda. Now, moving away from this article, I want to talk about Sagar and Jetty from The Hill, which The Hill is, I mean, they're kind of split between a progressive, Crystal Ball, and Sagar, who is technically a Republican. But I think the show kind of leans more towards the progressive side. And I wanted to read a little bit of what Sagar was saying. And I would just play his words, but I don't know how much of that is going to be copyrighted. So just know that the words that I'm about to read to you are not my words. This is the words of Sagar and Jetty from the show The Hill. He says, "If you don't know the broad contours of the lab leak theory, let me lay it out for you. We know coronavirus came from Wuhan, China, where there happens to be a lab called the Wuhan Institute of Virology. That lab was conducting a type of research known as gain-of-function research, where scientists attempt to create viruses which are more powerful than known in nature. The theory being that you can then create cures for potential diseases of the future. That type of research is incredibly risky. So much so that it was banned by the US government under the Obama administration. But what we know is that Dr. Anthony Fauci, the so-called hero of the pandemic itself, is the chief proponent of gain-of-function research within the US government. So much so, he works within the Trump administration to overturn that ban while nobody was looking in 2017. We now also know that the US government under Fauci funded gain-of-function research at the Wuhan lab into bat coronavirus. We also know that the very people charged with investigating whether coronavirus leaked from the lab are those that facilitated funding of the type of research itself. In short, it's not about blaming China. If anything, if coronavirus did leak from a lab, it is the biggest indictment of the public health establishment in America, that we knowingly have been funding dangerous research in places with substandard safety protocols, which may have caused the worst pandemic in nearly a century." Wow. Those are some strong words. And there's something that Sagar and Jetty actually did not mention that we found out. What was very strange is that Bill Gates, the so-called healer of the pandemic, the one individual that shows up to every single mainstream channel, and though he's not a doctor, gives advice as to how to handle a pandemic, that this man had funded and still funds Dr. Fauci. I think to the tunes of almost 23 million, 21 million, I forget the exact number, but large enough. Let's put it that way. So, can you say conflict of interest? Crazy. Crazy. All right, so reading further. Okay, so you're with me. Here is where Nichols Wade comes in with stunning new reporting and analysis which dramatically indicts American authorities. Wade lays out how the NIH and the NIAID funnel dollars to gain-of-function research in Wuhan despite a US government ban. That this funneling occurred specifically because Dr. Fauci or Dr. Francis Collins, or possibly both, overruled US government policy through an exemption loophole, and Wade quotes an expert who says both of these officials have systematically thwarted efforts by the White House, Congress, scientists, and science policy specialists to regulate gain-of-function research of concern. In other words, Fauci, the hero of the pandemic, was intimately involved in funding and perpetuating the research that very likely is what caused this whole thing in the first place. And the cover-up here really is stunning. I'm sure all of you are again wondering why all of you should be listening to a guy on YouTube like me or Joe Rogan read this type of article in a non-mainstream source just to get the most basic facts about probably the most important story of the century. It's in that question too where Wade shines. To my knowledge, no major newspaper or tech TV network has yet provided readers with an in-depth news story of the lab escape scenario. Worst, he lays out how in the world of science, reporting journalisms are usually not skeptical of the claims of their sources like one may be in political reporting. That this was very cynically exploited by the very scientists who may be responsible for this entire thing. I love how they say no major newspaper or tech TV networks. Tech TV networks, what do they mean by that? Could they mean the very place where we're at right now? The one who decided to demonetize that very video where I was trying to tell people that a pandemic was happening, that I was giving a general timeline that ended up being accurate, that the information in which this might have been airborne was not just accurate, but also ahead of its time? That all those videos, that all the information was thwarted, demonetized, disincentivized? That the entire channel was demonetized because we were said to be dangerous. Dangerous. Is this dangerous to tell people that a virus is happening? Is it dangerous to then be right that the virus may have actually escaped a biosecurity lab? That's dangerous. Is it dangerous to protect the US's interest over China, to let people know basic facts that might be manipulated by the WHO, who has an interest with a different country that is our adversary, that has threatened us militaristically, that is stealing our data, that is stealing our intellectual property? That's dangerous. Or is it dangerous that in 2016 this channel mentioned Jeffrey Epstein and how much of a predator this man was? Now think about this. A year after we say that Jeffrey Epstein is a sexual predator, that he is a dangerous man, that in 2017 Bill Gates goes to Jeffrey Epstein's house, stays over the mansion, all the while Bill Gates is staying in that mansion a year after we already called this man out, this monster, YouTube is proactively disincentivizing my videos by demonetizing that very information that I tried to provide a year before. That Jeffrey Epstein is a sexual predator and a dangerous man. And this is all happening while ABC is basically locking that story out, shoveling the story. So ABC is complicit and covering up a story of a sexual predator while countless women are being endangered, I should say girls, are being endangered by this man. But no, I'm the dangerous one for telling people that. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the nature of what truth-telling channels, people who are actually trying to seek the truth for the sake of truth, are having to deal with. They're having their entire future stripped by a mega corporation who favors propaganda, who favors stories that support billionaire interests, that support individuals who have ties to monsters, essentially. All we are trying to do is investigate. You know how this channel got demonetized as an entire channel, meaning I can never make money on YouTube since it took 9 months for this channel to be monetized, and I think it's been over a year since we've gone through the reapplication process, all of which is supposed to take within a month for them to actually review, but they just let it linger. Over 2 years of potential work just out in space with nobody reacting to it. Well, this channel got demonetized because we were live feeding a protest. At least that's the last video that we shot before they said it's over with your ability to make money with ads. It was a live feed of a protest that then turned into riots. So I wasn't trying to capture riots. I didn't know that buildings were going to be burned that day. I was simply capturing reality. So while in the 80s, cameras were actually used to protect the protesters that helped take down the Berlin Wall, that communist symbol that was so detrimental, that represented so many horrific aspects of history, including Stalinism, that when that wall came down, it came down because protesters were protected because of cameras, and the soldiers would be very reticent of attacking these protesters when there were cameras all around them. You're telling me that the camera was the one thing that protected the protesters when the Berlin Wall came down, but in this day and age, it's the one thing that destroyed my career? That trying to tell the truth, that going out and live streaming the truth is what destroyed my career? That is the position that YouTube has put this channel under? I don't know what else to say other than, are you sure you're in the right side of history? And I don't care if somebody watches this. I hope somebody on YouTube watches this, because they should know the type of damages they do to truth tellers, people who really mean well, who want to just talk about the truth for the sake of truth. Do you think I'm making money on these videos? I don't make money. I do it because I believe in them. And though that may not be important to YouTube and they might be more concerned about their advertisers or the billionaire interests of their advertisers, it doesn't make them any more credible to the user base when this is how they treat the independent creators, which was essentially the bread and butter of the company. When they're essentially tossed out for major networks that are willing to lie to the people, to create propaganda, and to protect the interests of individuals connected with people like Jeffrey Epstein. Need I say more, ladies and gentlemen? This is Felipe speaking, signing out. Is the virus more dangerous? For example, could it be a deadlier type of virus simply because it was coming from this lab as opposed to a naturally occurring source?